we'll put the emphasis more on the Gemara, and then we'll see. So we're going to look at the Gemara now in the middle of Daf Ches Amud Aleph, and the first word in the line is Omar. Omar le Rav Achami Difti le Ravina. So you can find such a line. It's slightly above Tosas Divrei Maskil Rava. Omar le Rav Achami Difti le Ravina. Now, what we're saying, just to reiterate, is that even after we have the pasuk Leha, which prohibits Yibum in the case of Achos Ishto, how do we know that other arayos have the same status? Because the word Leha specifically appears in the context of Achos Ishto. Michti, Kol arayos ikalekashinu li'eshes ach. We have two options here. We're standing at a crossroads. We can take the entire bag of arayos and direct it in one of two directions. We can attach it to H's ach. H's ach now becomes the paradigm case. The exception to that rule of H's ach, which the Torah was matir for Yibum, is achos, but that's only an exception to the rule. The rule for all arayos will be H's ach. And in the context of a hekesh between all the arayos and H's ach, then we would come to the conclusion that just like the Torah was matir Yibum in the case of the Erev of H's ach, the Torah was matir Yibum in the case of all our other arayos, the only exception being Achos Ishto, derived from the pasuk Lel. The other possibility, says the Gemara, is Ikalak Shinu Achos Isha. Maybe Achos Isha is not the exception to the rule, but rather the paradigm case. And therefore, just like the Torah excluded Achos Isha from Yibum, the Torah is going to exclude all arayos from Yibum. My chazis dakshriye le'achos Isha akshinu le'eshes ach. Gemara says, I don't know which way to turn. You're assuming, that was the last Gemara that we did yesterday, that based on the hekesh of kol ha'toevas ha'elu v'nichriso, equating all arayos into one, indivisible entity, equal uniform entity, we're going to equate all the arayos to Achos Isha. Why do you say so? What compels you? Maybe we should equate all the arayos to Eshes Ach. And the Gemara now offers an entire slew of answers to this question. The first answer is Ibais Ema Lekula Ulechum Lechum Makshina. We have an option to set up a Hekesh Lekula or an option of Lechumra. We always choose Lechumra. And therefore it makes sense that since the Torah prohibits Achos Isha, and that's the Chumra of Achos Isha, we're going to equate all other arayos with Achos Isha and derive the conclusion that all the other arayos, likewise, are prohibited in the case of Yibum. And again, you might say that, wait a second, this is not really a Chumra, it's also a Kula, because it means that if the Yevama falls in front of the Yavam and it's an Ereva relationship, therefore she doesn't need Chalitza, and there's no Zikas Yibum. So that's certainly a Kula. But the Gemara thinks that it's primarily a Chumrah when you prohibit Yibum and you insist on the Erva and you remove the Erva from any Heter Yibum. Yibum is a Matir, and if we remove Erva from that Matir, that is called and classified as a Chumrah. Ibay Sema. Another possible answer as to why we prefer a Hekesh Achos Isha rather than Achos Eshes Ach. Where it says, Lekula v'chumra lechumra makshinon. I'm sorry, that we did already. Ibais Ema Hacha Trei Isure Hacha Trei Isure Trei Alfinan Aval Hacha Chad Isure V'lo Alfinan Chada Trei Mechada. In the case of Achos Isha, we have a double error, because in addition to being Achos Isha, she's also Eshes Ach. It's never a case of even without Eshes Ach. In the case of Shara Rayos, like Achos Isha, we have Trey Isure, we have whatever Erev you're talking about, plus Ashes Ach, and therefore it is, we say in Yiddish, Lonsach. Lonsach means it's attractive, it's logical to make a heke, Shara Rayos, Tachos Isha. Because in both cases, we're talking about Trey Isure. However, although Trey be Trey, Yalfin and Hacha, in the case of Chada Isura, if you want to make a hekech to Eishes Ach, well, Eishes Ach is only one Isur Erva, and Trey Michada Lo Yalfinan, now you want to derive other arayos from Eishes Ach, that's less attractive, less logical, because then you're talking about two Isurim and you're equating into one Isur. Because once there's an Erva, as we said before, you're topping that Erva onto Eishes Ach. And Eishes Ach is only one Erva, now you're talking about two Arayos. It makes more sense to set up a Hekesh between two Arayos and two Arayos than two Arayos and one Erva. Now, until now, we've been assuming that the logic or the Havamina that justifies the word Olel in the case of an Erva is Hol Ishtre Ishtre, that once the Torah was Matir Eishes Ach, then we would assume it would be Matir another Erva as well. And even though now we're being Matir two Arayos in a case of an Erva, Eishes Ach plus another Erva, but nevertheless, once the Torah set up the Matir or Eishes Ach, then we extend that Matir even for another Erva. And that was based on the case where you have a heter for the Mitzorah to enter into the Azorah, at least the Bahonos Yadav, Raglov into the Azorah. And even if he's a carry, then we'll apply the principle that once the Torah was Matir entering into the Azorah for a Mitzorah, the Torah therefore is going to be Matir if this Mitzorah is also a Balkari. And here too, we have a compelling logic that if the Torah was Matir one Ereva, then if you add another Ereva, then for the sake of Yibum, the Torah will be Matir a second Ereva as well, and that's whole Ishtre Ishtre. But Rava wants to suggest a different approach and another answer to the question, why do I need the word Olel to create a P'tur, to derive a P'tur of Ereva in the case of Yibum? Rava Amar, Ereva lo tzricha kra. I don't really need a pasuk to prohibit Erva and exclude Erva from Yibum. And Rava says that I would logically come to the conclusion that an Erva is excluded from Yibum, and that's because an Erva has kares. The ein esei docha losa says sheish bo kares. Rava is unwilling to derive the conclusion of Esei dochalosa sashish bo kares from the Havamina of Eshavsosei Tishmoru Ani Hashem, and also from the Chomosh Hosecha, because in those cases there was a specific reason for the Havamina, but Rav is also rejecting the Havamina of Hol V'Ishtre Ishtre. But Ki Yitzter Kra, why do we need the pasuk of Olel to prohibit the case of an Erev and Yibum? Lemesar Tzara. This is very lumpish. He wants to say the following. Let's say you have Achos Isha, and the Torah writes, Isha lachosa lo sikach litzrar legalos ervasa oleha b'chayel. In this very pasuk of Oleha, the Torah is addressing the case of Achos Isha plus a tzara. And what the Torah wants to teach me here in the word Oleha is that just like the Erva herself does not fall for Yibum, and that we derive logically because Ein Esei Dochalosa Sheish Bo Kares, so too Hatzara does not fall for Yibum. That's what the Torah is saying, Lo Sikach Litzra, that there would be an Isur, a prohibition to be Litzra. Litzra means to consummate a Yibum with a Tzara. So Tzaras Erva becomes prohibited on the Yavam based on the Isur of H's Ah, She is exempt from Yibum, and this we derive from the word olel, because it says osikach litzrar legalos ervasa olel. But as far as the erva herself is concerned, lo tzarech kra. Rav is of the opinion that we have no justified havamina, that we would entertain the possibility that the mitzvah even would override an isa kares of achos ishta, of an erva. That was never even a havamina. Doesn't even register on the Richter scale. We need the word oleh to teach me the law of ervas, of tzaras erva. So the Gemara asks the following question. The language of the Brisa seems to be problematic for Rava. Why? B'chi, erva, lo tzricha kra. You don't need a pasuk to teach me an Isa Yibum and an erva. But Sanya, what about the Brisa that we quoted earlier, which darshans the word oleha? And if you read the Brisa carefully, it says, Ainli Elohi. We only know that she is excluded from an erva. So Rasa Minayin, it means that the Brisa is talking about the P'tur of Yibum in the case of the vis-a-vis the erva herself. And then the Brisa goes on to say, Ainli Elohi, and so Rasa Minayin. So the Brisa seems to be using the word Oleha to derive Ainli Elohi, meaning the erva herself, Achos Ishta. So the Gemara answers no. The Brisa is not quoting the Josh of Oleh for the erva, but Mishum Tzarasa. So when it says Ainli Elohi, it doesn't mean that the Oleha is necessary to derive he, meaning the erva herself. That we know logically because Ein Esei Dochalos Seshesh. But rather, Ainli Elohi is coming to use the word Oleh to derive Tzaras erva. So the minayin of this Brisa is not going on the erva, but rather on the tzaras erva. And for that, the Brisa quotes the pasuk Oleh and derives the conclusion of tzaras erva, that she is also like the erva herself, and she's p'tura. So the Gemara asks for Ketani. Let's see the next part of the Brisa. Ainli Elohein. We only know that they are, meaning that the other arayos are asuros b'yibu because they are equated to achos isha, but tzarosei minayin. So it seemed like the Brisa is standing on the shoulders of the hekesh that equate all arayos together. So the subject now is not tzaroseihen, but rather from Oleh we're deriving erva, and then from the erva of achos isha we're going to jump, and by virtue of a hekish of all arayas, we're going to derive that all arayas have the same status as achos isha, and they're excluded from yibum. And then the Brisa goes on to ask tzarosei minayin. So the first part of the Brisa clearly indicates that we need a hekesh of all arayas together in order to set up a hekesh to all arayas and achos isha. So when the Brisa says Ainli Elohein, it means the erva herself. So the Gemara again answers the same answer. Mishum tzarosei, and we really don't need any pasuk to establish a hekesh between all the arayas and achos isha. They all have the same din of an erva, and we don't need a pasuk to derive that there's no yibum in the case of an erva. But what do we need is we need a pasuk to derive tzaras erva. Mishum tzarosei. This hekesh between erva And all the arayos is not to teach me the law of erva that she doesn't fall, but rather to teach me the tsaras erva. Toshma. Now the Gemara wants to ask another kasha on Rava from Rebbe. Rebbe seems to darshan the p'tur of arayos in Yibum from the pasuk. Rebbe Omer. It says in Parshas Yibum, 4 and Perikafei. I'll read the whole pasuk. It says Yevamot Yavo Aleha Ulekacha Lo Lisha V'Yibma. Now it doesn't say V'Lakach Lo Leisha, but rather it says Ulekacha Lo Leisha. So V'Lakach, V'Lakcha, if it would have just said V'Lakach Lo Leisha, that would have been sufficient. Why does it say Ulekacha, right, with a mapik hey? The word lekacha with a mapik hey means her, and that's a mute. The extra hey is a mute. That dafka she is v'lokach, he can marry her. But there's another yavama that he cannot take as a wife. He cannot be mekayim mitzvah yibum. Lekacha, to the exclusion. And then it says in the same pasuk v'yibma, and it could have said v'yabeim, and that's a mute to say this one and not another one. So from this we're going to learn less are tsaros and arayos. Just to summarize, this brisa of Rebbe has 2 extra words that are being darshaned here, 2 superfluous words. One is v'lakach v'lakcha, and the other is v'yabeim v'yibma. And in both cases, the pasuk seems to be mamayit. It's excluding. And it's excluding another woman from Yibum, or shall we say another category of women from Yibum. What are the 2 categories that are being excluded under A, the extra hay of Lekacha, and B, with the extra hay of the Yibma? 2 categories. And the answer would be that the first category is arayos, that Vilakcha means you can marry her because she's only Eishes Achim, but she's not an Erva, but you cannot be Mekayim the mitzvah of Yibum with an erva, additional erva to Eishes Achim. And then the pasuk v'yibma is coming to be mamayit soras erva. In any event, we see clearly that even arayos themselves need a pasuk to be excluded from Yibum. Logically, we would not say that there's an Isur Yibum in the case of an Erva. Against Rava, we need a mute. Again, not the mute of Oleh. We can let Rava get away with it, that Oleh is coming to exclude Saras Erva. But what are you going to do with the possible Lakha, according to Rebbe, which is coming to prohibit or exclude an Erva? Why? According to Rava, why do we need a pasuk to exclude an erva? It's ein essay dochalosa sheish bo karetz. Now, how do we reconcile this brisa, the double drasha of a lakha v'yibma of Rebbe with Rava? And the Gemara tries to answer this by saying, Ema, perhaps we could interpret Rebbe when he says lesar tsaros ve'arayos. Doesn't mean sorrows as a separate category and arayos as a separate category, but rather lesser sorrows shel arayos. So again, we're back to square one, like Rava, that we only need a drasha to exclude saros. But as far as the erva herself, we don't need a pasuk to exclude erva. And what does it mean, less are tzarach rayas? We just brought two psukim. We brought the pasuk v'lakcha, we brought the pasuk v'yidma. So two miyutim. If you talk about a raya, why do you need two miyutim? It'd be more logical to assume that one of the miyutim is to exclude the erva itself, and then we have another miyut to exclude tzara. But if you're talking about a logical assumption that an erva is out of the ballpark as far as the yibum is concerned, then you need one pasuk to teach you tzara, like two psukim. But Trey cried kadnasifle, right? Rebbe in the Brisa brings v'lakacha v'yivma. My love, chadli erva and chadli tzara. We're against Rava. We need a pasuk to exclude erva. Now I'm not sure exactly why Rava is committed to accept Rebbe, but I have a feeling that no one argues against this Brisa of Rebbe. I mean, Rebbe was the one who said it, but there was no dissenting opinion. I mean, it says v'lakcha. Clearly, it could have said v'lakach. It says v'yivma. What are we going to do with these two drushes? And this is a problem for Rava. So again, although the Brisa mentions Rebbe, and you don't know if Rava is committed to accept every opinion on the face of the earth of Rebbe, but I don't think anybody argues against it because there are two psukim in the Torah. So again, the Gemara asks for Trey Kroy Kanosible, my love, Chadli Erva, Chadli Tzara. Look, we don't need a drasha to exclude Erva. That's clear. That's logical, and we don't need a drasha for it. Idi ve'idi, meaning both the Lokcha and the Yidma, they're both coming to teach me Litzara. What does that mean, Litzara? Chad l'meisar tzara b'makom mitzvah, but chad l'meisar tzara shalom b'makom mitzvah. Really interesting. There's a hava. I mean, I think we once mentioned this in the past that the Isur Tzara could apply outside, even outside the framework of Yibum. And what would that mean? The Mishrei Tzara Shalom B'Makom Yibum. So he has a picture of this, which is Lamed Dalet. Where is Lamed Dalet? Not on the page here. You have a diagram? You have one? No? Okay. You give me a minute. I just want to. I don't always understand the diagrams, but oh. Yeah. So he's got Yaakov. Yaakov is married to Sarah. No, I'm sorry. Yaakov has a daughter named Sarah. Sarah is married to Yitzchak. And Yitzchak has another wife named Rivka. Okay. Now Yitzchak dies. And Rivka is not related to Yaakov, correct? Yitzchak married another wife named Rivka. So Sarah is the daughter of Yaakov. But now Rivka is at Sarah's Erva. Has nothing to do with Yibum over here because, the father is not Miyabim, the wife of his son. It's only a brother's Miyabim. Yaakov wants to marry Rivka, and he can't marry Rivka in this Havamina because Rivka is at Sarah's Erva, because she and Sarah, the daughter of Yaakov, were married to Yitzchak. That's Sarah's Erva Shalom B'Makom Mitzvah. And the answer is that we have a special miut to teach me that Yaakov is allowed to marry Rivka, and the erva of Bito, in this case of Sarah, does not generate an Isur erva on the Tzara, meaning on Rivka. That's what we have. Okay. Now my timer. What's the reason that a tzara only becomes prohibited within the context of the mitzvah of Yibum? So we have the drush of the Yabem, and it doesn't say V'yabem, it says V'yibma. And that's a miut, that b'makom Yibum hu di asire Sarah. Right, so we had the first pasuk v'lakcha, and from the word v'lakcha we excluded Sarah, and that's in the case of b'makom mitzvah. Now we have the Yibma, and that's going to exclude Sarah. Shalom b'makom Yibum. Sorry, what I mean is to exclude Sarah from the Isa that we derive from Velach. Very interesting. The Yibma is a limitation on Velachcha, meaning the Yibma tells you about Medvarim, when do you apply the principle of Velachcha, meaning that you exclude a Tsaras Erva. That's only b'makom mitzvah, but shalom b'makom mitzvah, you don't prohibit a tsaras erva. Rav Ashi masnisa nami daika. If you read our Mishnah, you can be medayek and support Rav, meaning that the erva itself does not need a pasuk. The katani hameshis reinoshim potros tsaras. Ilupturos upotros. What is Rav Ashi's deal? It says Hameshe Noshim Potros, and it doesn't say Turos. Oh, I understand. He's saying it should have said Turos upotros. In other words, first being machadish to me that they are pturos, meaning that the erva itself is out of the ballpark as far as Yibum, and then add the word upotros as far as the tsaras erva. So the Mishnah really doesn't even relate to the ptur of the erva itself. It already assumes that that's a davar posh. Rather, the Mishnah wants to tell you potros tsaras saying. So the erva itself is ptura mitzad svara. Let's say, ein esei dochalos sheish bom kares, like Rava said. So the Mishnah doesn't have to teach me that an erva itself is eino misyabemes. Rather, the Mishnah wants to teach me That Hartzara is Einamus Yavim. Shmamina, we can really prove Rav Shita from our Mishnah that Erva herself is Ptura Misvora. See, the truth is, Rabbi Osai, the impression I get is that this whole Gemara, which is in Masechet Yevamot, that seems to be dealing with Yevamos, is not really about Yevamos at all. Because what difference does it make whether you tell me that an Erva in Yibum is excluded because of a pasuk or because I know it logically? I wouldn't spend an entire Amud of Gemara without any nafkamina. But I have a feeling that this Gemara is really about, the name of this Masechta, if this sugya was named as a separate Masechta, would not be Masechta Yevamos. It would be a Masechta called Esei Dochalosas. What are the parameters of Esei Dochalosas? And without Rava, we would say that Esei Dochalosas Afilu Sheish Bo Karetz. And Rava is insisting that ain't Esei Dochalosas Sheish Bo Karetz. Yibum comes in through the back door because now we look at our Mishnah, and the Mishnah doesn't even bother telling us that the Erva herself is P'tura min Yibum, because ain't Esei Dochalosas Sheish Bo Karetz. That supports Rava. But the name of the sugya is not it's not erva in Hilchos Mitzvahs Yibum, but rather a mitzvah in the laws of Dechia when you have a collision between an essay and a losas. How far can I go? Can an essay override a losas? Even in the case of a losas sheyesh bo karetz, and we're going to prove from our Mishnah that it was a double pasha that ein essay go for losas. The truth is that we had a strong habit that maybe essay could override a los sheyesh bo karetz. If you remember when we spoke about kibud av on Shabbos, or maybe even binyan beis hamikdash on Shabbos, and streifas bas kohen. I mean, we had all these cases of a collision between a mitzvah and Shabbos, and we needed psukim to derive that we don't override the Shabbos. And we were at a crossroads. It could be we don't override the Shabbos because the Chamira, the Chumrah of Shabbos. And that would mean that ain't esli dochalos sheyesh bo karetz. But then we had a svara to say that even in Machamer, there was a havamina that we would override the Shabbos, for which the pasuk had to exclude a case of Machamer. And obviously, if there was such a havamina, then we're not operating with a Chumrah de Shabbos because Machamer is like a regular law. So if we exclude Chumrah de Shabbos, we might come to the conclusion that Esei Dochalos Sheyesh Bo Karetz. Now Rava is free; he's a free agent; he can reject that all. But the Mishnah should be a little bit more forthcoming and should have spelled out that there's no yibum by an erva. Why? Because the essay is not Dochalos Sheyesh Bo Karetz. So meaning, even if I accept Rava's hashkafa olam, his worldview that an essay cannot override a los sheyesh bo karetz, I still think the Mishnah could have been very nice about it and mentioned it. There's no yibum in an error. No pochos sort of say it. It doesn't say pturos. The word pturos is omitted, is ignored. In other words, what I mean to say is that even if Rav is absolutely aduk, he's convinced that ain't essay dochalos sheyesh bo karetz, but he has to admit that there's plenty of room for a havamina to say otherwise. So the Mishnah should have been very outspoken about it, even according to Rav. Now, Rav might be arguing that the Mishnah really should have said paturos, but excuse me. But the Mishnah did not write pturos in order to teach me that ain't essay dochalosas sheyesh bo karetz. You follow what I mean? This would be a very interesting twist. That Rava is telling me that when they authored the Mishnah, they deliberately omitted a word to teach me this conclusion that ein essay dochalos sheyesh bo karetz. Now the Gemara asks another kasha. According to Rava, the word Aleha in the parsha of Achos Isha in Yibun is coming to exclude Tsaras Erev, correct? So the Gemara asks, Ma'ishna Erev the Lotri for Kra is Tsaranami Lotri Boy. What was your logic that you don't need a pasuk to derive the exclusion of an Erev from Yibun? That's because Ein Esei Tochelos Sheish Kares. Is Tsaranami Lotri Boy Kra? Mishum di Ein Esei Tochelos Sheish Kares. You shouldn't need the pasuk mitzvah. Now, do I understand this Gemara? Not sure. Ein Esei Tochelos. To be honest with you, I don't understand what's going on. Can anyone enlighten me here? What does Ein Esei Tochelos first have to do with Tsaras Erev? I don't get it. I mean, the question is whether there's a mitzvah Yibun in Tsaras Erev. And every Yibun requires overriding an Isur Lav, Sheish Kares, because of Eish. But the Torah is matter Eish Makom Yibun. So maybe the Tzara falls for Yibun. Is there any reason why logically a Tzara of an Erev should not fall for Yibun? Meaning Reuven and Shimon married two sisters, correct? And Reuven, he was married to another woman besides the sister of Shimon's wife. So now Reuven's two wives fall for Yibun to Shimon. One of them we'll call Leah, who's the sister of Rachel, that's the wife of Reuven. And the other one we'll call Sarah. I mean, Sarah's not related to Shimon in any way. So why should she fall for Yibun? What does that have to do with Esei Tochelos? Unless you have a pasuk that excludes a Tsaras Erev from Yibum, but that's what we're trying to establish over here. Unless I'm missing a piece of the puzzle, maybe there's some independent drasha.
I mean, a note here says,
yeah,
the pasuk that says Mitzvor also contains the Korah. So there's the Erva and the Tzara are both subject to Korah.
Wait, are we talking about the following pasuk? Let me read a pasuk to you and tell me if that's the pasuk you have in mind. You probably have it in English translation, right? The Isha el achosa lo sikach litzror legalos ervasa oleh b'chayeh. That's the pasuk I have. So where does it say Kares?
Yes, the rest.
Yeah, there must be a different. There must be a different.
That's the one they're talking about.
Maybe there's more in that pasuk. I don't know if I'm reading the whole pasuk. Because if there's another pasuk, that would really solve my problem. I just want to read one little, while you're looking, if you don't mind, Steve, I just want to read this out loud. He says, "V'ein ze'el esfars hamakshon, achaliba de emes enokein, Ela ein ha'erva oseres es tzaras kol. He tells you to look in the Ha'oris and the footnotes back on that Gimel. I'm not sure if I have time for that right now. This maybe the Gemara is referring to Zikas Yibum. Wait, who asked me this question? You asked me this question, Steve. What about Zikas Yibum? Remember you asked me that question? Right. So maybe what the Gemara is saying is the following. The Rachel and Leah now fall for Yibum to Shimon. And, right? I'm sorry, Rachel and Sarah, right? And Rachel is the sister of Shimon's wife, Leah. Now, as far as Rav is concerned, no, I thought I had something, but it doesn't work out. Because Sarah is not related to Rachel at all. They just happen to both be married to the same husband. Why should Sarah be prohibited from Shimon, Yavam? How do you take the erev of Achos Isha of Rachel and now spread it over to Sarah? I mean, Sarah is not the sister of Shimon's wife, Leah. So how do you take the erev of Rachel and she spreads her wings over the Sarah? Ella wanted Sarah's Aisha's but on that there's a mitzvah yibum. But why shouldn't the mitzvah yibum apply to Sarah? I understand why it can't apply to Rachel, because in addition to the erev of Aisha's there's another erev on top to the of Achos. But what does that have to do with Sarah? The Gemara is saying that we don't need a pasuk for Sarah. Why not? What do you mean? That's what Yibum is all about. There's no other erev here besides the erev of Yibum. Unless the Gemara knows that there is no Yibum in this case, because she's in Tzaras erev. But I thought we're learning that from this pasuk itself. There must be another pasuk here. That's what I think Steve is trying to find for me. That there's another pasuk here. And look at the next Gemara. Amalei Rav Acha bar Bibi, Mar Liravina. Kamina Mishmei de Rava, Sarah Nami lo itzukra. Sarah doesn't need a pasuk. Wow. Because Ein Esei Tochalos Sheish Bokari. You understand what I'm saying? The Gemara isn't rejected because of my reason. The Gemara insists that Sarah does not need a pasuk. There must be some sort of it works like this, Steve. Maybe this is what you mean. It says, Isha lachosa lo sikach litzra. Stop from it before we get to the rest of the pasuk. And lo sikach litzra is referring to the tzara. So the first part of the pasuk, Isha lachosa, is referring to achos ishta. And then it says lo sikach litzra. And that's telling me that what? That the tzara is excluded. And then the end of the pasuk now becomes superfluous. The galos ervosa oleha. So what? Why did the Torah add the word oleha? And you can't tell me that oleha is coming to prohibit the tzaras erva, because that I know from lo sikach litzro. Again, I'm just inventing words. I have no idea if what I'm saying makes any sense. But now we could say that the word oleha is coming to tell you a mute. A mute means that in this case, the tzaras erva has the status of an erva. But if it's not a case of yibum, like we discussed earlier, then there is no isur tzara. Again, we still don't have an answer to the question of Rebbe, because Rebbe derived that same conclusion from the extra hay of the Yivma. In any event, look, I'm not going to tell you that what I just said is MS. I don't want to fool anybody here. But I think it'll just give you enough energy to go on in the Gemara, you know. So Amalei Rav Ach, etc., etc. Achi kamina mitzmei derava. Saranami lo itzur kra. And why Saranami lo itzur kra? And the answer is because lo sikach litzra already excludes her from yibum. And then if you exclude her from yibum, then you go back to the erva of Eishes Ah. I'm sorry, but I think it's absolutely wrong. Because the Gemara is dealing with Esei Dochalosas. You can't tell me she's excluded from you. Oh well. I tried. I didn't try to fool anybody. I'm missing a piece here. If the Gemara is operating with Ein Esei Dochalosas in the case of Tzaras Erva, it must be the Erva of Eishes Ah. But how do you get to the Erva of Eishes Ah until you say that she's excluded from Yibum? And then if she's excluded from Yibum, why does the Gemara need Esei Dochalosas? Apparently the Gemara is assuming she is included in the midst of Yibum. So if she's included in the midst of Yibum, every single case of Yibum, the Torah was matir, overrides the Yisur of Eishasat. So why not do that in the case of Tzaras Erva? I don't get it. Let's go on and see, maybe by chance the Gemara is going to clarify this. So we're on the top now of Chesam Beis. L'mishrei Sora Shalom Makom Mitzvah. I don't know what we're going to do with the extra hay in the word the Yigma. We're asking my timer. If you're deriving from a leah that a tzara is mutter, shalom makom mitzvah, how do you see that in the word oleh? So the Gemara answers that the source for the isur tzara is litzra. Is Amar Kra, and the Torah says with regard to each alachosa l'tikach litzra, the galos ervasa oleha b'chayeha. And now the Gemara introduces a gzeirat shalom. Bimkom oleha, right? The Torah writes Yevamot yavo oleha huda sira shalom b'makom Yevamot yavo oleha sharia. So where's the gzeirat shalom? Says Isha lachos kachutza galos ervasa oleha b'chayeha, and then it says Yevamot yavo oleha. So we have the word oleha twice. Oleha, oleha. So we're going to say the following. In the first oleha, it says lo sikach litzra, which means that we're talking about the makom yibum. Otherwise, we wouldn't say lo sikach. And then the word oleha in the pasuk Yevamot Yevamot is telling you that only in the situation of lo sikach litra, which is called the makom yibum, huda asir. Shalom makom mitzvus yibum is then shari, when the Torah does not have a possibility of applying Yevamot Yevamot oleha, right? In the case of shalom makom mitzvus, like the case of Yaakov and Sarah and Rivka and all that, is shari. The tzara is muteres. Okay, so what I'd like to do now, maybe we'll take a break here in the Gemara. We learned quite a bit of Gemara today. And let's take a look. I know you don't have the photocopies, but just to get like a little bit of an introduction to the next piece that we're up to here in the Yalkut Bi'urim. What I want to do is first, as a segue here, to talk about whole Ishrei, and I know that John and Sammy, you weren't here yesterday. Am I correct? So I want to give you the gist of what we did yesterday about whole Ishrei. This is very, very important. And what we're trying to do is offer three approaches to answer the Turi Evan's kash. Turi Evan was the Shagasari. And he says, what happens if you have a case of a Nazir who's also a Kohen and he loses one of his close relatives? Does he go to the cemetery and to the burial or not? Now, with regard to a Kohen, the Kohen says explicitly, the Torah says explicitly at the beginning of Parshas Emor, that for the sake of burying his close relatives, he will override the Isur Tumah of a Kohen. In the case of a Nazir, the Torah prohibited. Now we have a case of a Nazir who's also a Kohen. Can we apply the principle, asks the Shagasari, of whole V'ishtei Ishtei? Once the Torah was Matir Kohen, then for this fellow who's also at the same time a Nazir, we should be Matir it for a Nazir, that he should be allowed to be Matami to one of his Zayin Krovim. And it's perfectly parallel, says the Shagasari, to a case of a Mitzorah Balkeri, because B'Toras Balkeri is not allowed to enter into the Azorah, but now you added to boot the status of Tumas Mitzorah, and as far as Mitzorah is concerned, the Torah was matir him to put his Bahonos into the Azorah. Here too, B'Toras Kohen, he's allowed to be Mitami L'Mesid for one of his close relatives. So that heter should now be extended to a case of a Kohen who's also a Nazir. And we have three answers to this question: Rabbi Akiva Eiger, and Rabbi Chanan, and the Imrei Moshe, that's Rabbi Moshe Sokolovsky. Let's start with Rabbi Akiva Eiger. Rabbi Akiva Eiger says that we don't apply the principle of Hoel V'Ishrei to two separate Isurim, two categorically different Isurim. We only apply the principle Hoel V'Ishrei in a case where all these Isurim are compared together, and there's one root, so to speak, one overall umbrella organization that combines all these Isurim, integrates them into one unit. Therefore, let's say, for example, we have Tumah, and there are two different subcategories of Tumah. When the Torah says you're not allowed to be Machalel, the Beis HaMikdash, in this case, the Machne Shechina and the Azara, so it applies to this Tameh, and that Tameh applies to a Mitzorah, and it applies to a Balkeri. Now, within that context of one rubric that integrates many different subcategories of Isur, we can apply the principle of Hoel V'Ishtei Ishtei. If the Torah is matir biol lemigdash in the case of tumas mitzora, then if this mitzora is also at the same time balkeri, it's all part of one Isser of bias migdash, and therefore we can be matir bias migdash. That will apply in Arayos and Yibum as well. And we're going to apply the principle of whole Ishtri from Achos Ishto to all the other Arayos, because all the Arayos are combined and integrated into one whole of the Nichrasu Anafasha Se'elu, the Hekesh that unites all of the Surei Arayos. But in the case of Kohen and Nazir, these are two categorically different Isurim, Shemos of Isur. And therefore, the fact that one Shem Isur, in this case Kohen, has a Matir, that's not going to have any impact on the other Shem Isur, which is Nazir. Then we go on to Rebbe Chanan. Rebbe Chanan says the following, that let's go back to the Sibas HaIsur. And if we can construct in the Sibas HaIsur some connection, then we could apply the principle of Hol V'Ishtrei Ishtrei. So, for example, the Torah was matir for the sake of the mitzvah of mitzorah, of taras mitzorah, to enter into the azorah litzorech taros. That is what you call the Sibas HaHeter, and the Sibas HaIsur is, of course, Tumas Migdash. Or, for example, if you take the Isur of Eches Ach, then the Matir is for the sake of the mitzvah of Yibum. And therefore, when you have two Arayos, like Achos Ishto and another Erva, and now you apply the mitzvah of Yibum, we can apply whole the Ishtrei Ishtrei. If the Torah was Matir this Erva, call it Eches Ach, the Torah therefore is going to be Matir this Erva of Achos Ishto. So we go back to the Sibas HaIsur and the Matir of the Isur. However, says Rabbi Chanan beautifully, in the case of the Sibas HaIsur of Kohen and Nazir, we're talking about two different Kedushas. There's one Kedusha of a Nazir and another of Kahuna. And you can prove that in many different ways. I mean, the difference is, in the proof is in the pudding, the different kinds of Isurim that emanate from these two distinct Kedushas. So you're not going to tell me that the Kedusha of a Nazir is now going to be downgraded because he also happens to be a Kohen. You're adding another Kedusha, and now you're going to say that the Sibas HaMatir, which in this case is to be Matir Kedushas Kahuna for the sake of burying the dead, therefore we're going to apply that same Matir to Nazir because he also happens to be a Kohen. Then we get to the third answer, that of Rav Moshe Sokolovsky, the Imrei Moshe. And he writes that, second, Eino Domala Hoil the Ishtri Damrina Biyavam. Shari Lo Matzina Shatia Erva Asur Biyavam. Beloshi its tarif law Gam Iser Eishes Ach. Ki Ein Yibum Ella Bi Eishes Ach. I always get stuck at the last minute when I have to let you go. That's not good. Oh, so again, I think I just messed up the names, but not the Svaras. The Svaras that I told you are good. So the Svara that I gave you in the name of Rabbi Chanan is really the Svara of the Imrei Moshe. And the Imrei Moshe writes, Lo yitachin shehei nazir shu gam kohen yoser kal mi nazir sheino kohen. Right, so if he was only a nazir, that would be enough to generate the Isur Litami Lekrovim. You can't say by adding another Kedusha of Kohen, now the Kedushas Nazir gets downgraded. That's the Imay Moshe. Oh, so let me go back to Rabbi Chanan. I jumped the gun on Rabbi Chanan. Rabbi Chanan says that we have to go back to the Sibas HaIsur. And he says the following. Let's say, for example, in a case of a chaya, the Torah says that there's no Isur Chelev of a chaya. So you can't say that there's a matir because there's no Sibas HaIsur. The Torah never said that Chelev applies to a chaya. Same thing in Tumas Kohen, the Krovim. You can't say that there's a matir in the case of a Kohen for Tumas Krovim because the Torah never prohibited Tumah for a Kohen in the case of Krovim. So there's no ishtere on which you could say hold the ishtere. But in the case of Tumas, but in the case of an Erva, like for example, Eishes Ach, we have an Erva of Eishes Ach, and that Isur was generated by the Erva, and now we have a Matir on that Erva. We're going to extend that Matir to include even another Erva itself. And so too in the case of Mitzorah that's a Balkari, we have both Isurim, and now the Torah is Matir, the Isur Bila Lamigdash of what? Of a Nazir. Once that Matir is Chal, we can extend it to include a Balkari as well. But again, you have to start with the Sibas HaIsur and then apply a Matir. But in a case of Tumas Krovim, there, as far as the Kohen is concerned, there's no Sibas Matir because there's no Sibas Isur. The Torah never prohibited Tumas Kohanim in the case of Mitzvahs. Okay, so that's where we'll stop. And I'll take this opportunity to wish you a meaningful fast, and hopefully the Mashiach is going to come pretty soon. We'll build a Beis Hamikdash. Zoche to a Yeshua.